Okay, so we all know Western society is horrible these days, especially for young men. The economy is screwed, it's impossible to find a job, living expenses continue to skyrocket out of control, and society is constantly demonizing you. If you're a young man feeling these frustrations with society, understand your feelings are totally valid no matter how much society tries to gaslight you into believing otherwise. With that being said, I thought it would be good to make a video on a more positive note, focusing not only on problems but also possible solutions. There are many fulfilling alternative lifestyle paths you can take these days where you can drastically, or in some cases, even completely check out of society and live life on your own terms. I've done a lot of research for this video to try and find all the best possible options for young men these days, and I've now put them all together in one comprehensive tier list. So with that being said, let's get this show on the road. Number 1, living with parents. So I decided the best way to order this tier list would be to go from the least to the most extreme lifestyles. We'll kick this off with something that a lot of you are already doing, which is living with parents. The first thing I actually have to get off my chest is this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with living with your parents. Nothing at all. I've traveled over 20 countries in my life, and in almost every culture except for the toxic American one. Living with your parents until you're 30 or until whenever you're married is completely and entirely normal. And even in American culture, living with your parents is completely acceptable so long as you're not a young man. Young women who live with their parents don't face nearly as much criticism. Just another BS double standard that young men have to deal with in the West. Anyways, all that aside, I believe this is actually a great option for young men if your parents allow it. Boomers think if they kick you out at an early age, it teaches you responsibility and how to grow up, but it really doesn't. Maybe it did in their day. But these days, the only thing it's going to teach you is a massive lesson in debt and inflation. All the guys I met during my travels who lived with their parents till 30 had a lot more money saved up. They were actually able to buy a property of their own instead of just bleeding thousands of dollars to rent every month. And they had much better connections with their family. I would also argue that America's massive homeless problem has a lot to do with the fact that delusional American boomers think it's a good idea to kick their 18-year-olds out into this insane rental market, where apartments cost several $1,000s per month. If you are fortunate enough to have parents who are more understanding and allow you to do this, here are my recommendations. Try to find some gig economy or online freelance work. For example, being an Uber driver or food delivery guy where you can set your own hours. Or learn a skill that will allow you to do online freelance gigs such as tutoring English, graphic design, or web development. Every dollar you make while you live with your parents can go directly into your savings account, and I cannot stress how important this is. The more you save, the bigger of a war chest you can build to pursue any of the other options on this tier list, which you will soon see. The term living with parents generally gets a bad rap because it sort of implies you're just being complacent and doing nothing. Some people definitely do that, but you shouldn't view it that way. You should view it as a great opportunity to build yourself up financially and set yourself up for your next big move whenever you do decide to move out. The last thing I want to add about living with your parents is this. You will no doubt be on the receiving end of a lot of unjust criticism, whether it's from relatives, girls, or your parents themselves. It's important to learn to defend yourself, stand your ground, and clap back at this criticism. If they tell you you're a loser for living with your parents, tell them they're the loser for accumulating all this debt and bleeding thousands of dollars per month to their landlord. Tell them that in almost every other culture in the world, it's common to live with your parents, and those cultures have way less homeless rates, violence, and drug problems than America or the West. We'll put living with parents in the A tier. It's pretty accessible for most people. Unless, of course, if your parents are total boomer assholes insistent on kicking you out at 18 like mine were. It gives you a great opportunity to save up money, and young men in most cultures around the world are already doing this. Just make sure, again, you view this as an opportunity to build yourself up, not to get complacent and do nothing. Number 2, digital nomad. A lot of my friends who I met in my travels decided to go this route. This involves learning a skill in which you can use to make money online and traveling or live abroad in cheaper countries where your dollar will go much further. Before you guys chime in the comments, I am aware that this option still technically depends on society. Most of the options on the tier list will be some combination of relying on society in other ways, but drastically reducing your dependency on it. Truly, 100% checking out of society is obviously very difficult to do, though there are ways to do it, which we will cover later on. So, becoming a digital nomad is a very mixed bag. On one hand, if you manage to pull it off, it's one of, if not perhaps the best option on the list. You have flexible working hours, very decent money, you get to travel the world and see amazing places. The social and dating life is incredible as well. Literally nothing else on this list beats it if you can pull it off. But that's the catch, if you can pull it off. Pulling it off these days is harder than it's ever been. For a brief moment after the pandemic, there was a huge window to get these remote jobs, as work from home was adopted then normalized. Unfortunately, everyone realized how much they enjoyed working from home, and the remote work job market became insanely oversaturated and competitive in an instant. It's crazy to think that just a few years ago this was a great option, and now it's already almost impossible. Just goes to show you how fast the world changes now, and how readily adaptable you must be. That all being said, if you're willing to put in the work and some luck falls on your side, you can still pull this off. Just be patient and don't expect it to happen overnight. Some examples of online work include IT work, tutoring, customer service, and social media management. Hell, if you're really feeling bold, you can even try to become an influencer yourself. We'll put digital nomad in the C tier. The lifestyle you can have if you pull this off is absolutely S tier, but the barrier of entry and difficulty of achieving this these days is an F. So overall, it evens out to be a C, mid-tier option. Traveling. This one is often combined with the digital nomad lifestyle, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. There are countless amazing countries around the world that are way cheaper, cleaner, and in general just more enjoyable to live in than the US. It's also a common misconception that they're all super ghetto third world countries. This is just straight up American propaganda. Most of these countries are way safer than America is by any metric. Another misconception is that it costs too much money to travel. The reality is that it costs too much money to stay in America. You can stay in a youth hostel overseas for anywhere from $10 to $15 per night, whereas rent in America is anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 per month in most places. You tell me which one is more expensive. Traveling also gives you an incredible opportunity to meet new people and learn about new cultures all around the world. It is an incredible education in its own right. It is an incredibly rewarding and fulfilling experience. That being said, it's also not for the faint of heart. It requires a tremendous amount of social and personal courage, organizational skills, and an adaptable mindset to deal with airports, foreign countries, foreign money, finding your way around when no one speaks English, visa rules, and much more. It can be as stressful as it is rewarding. You will find yourself sleeping in airports, getting lost in foreign lands, not knowing where you're going to sleep the next night. The list goes on. I personally enjoyed this as it was a great personal challenge, and I now have a bunch of interesting stories to tell. But a lot of people would find this overwhelming, so it just depends on you whether you want to go this route or not. Traveling is a topic that is so broad and intricate that, to be honest, it deserves its own video entirely. If you guys would like a detailed video specifically dedicated on how to travel as a young man, let me know in the comments. We'll put traveling in the B tier. It's rewarding, fulfilling, adventurous. It's also something that, contrary to popular belief, can actually be very affordable and has a very low barrier to entry. The only drawback, as discussed, is that it can be very stressful, overwhelming, and it isn't for everyone. Number 4 and number 5, volunteering and seasonal adventure work. I decided to include number 4 and 5 at once, as they are kind of two sides of the same coin. Once again, this is something that is usually combined with traveling. The process of finding volunteer work and seasonal adventure work are mostly the same. There are only slight differences in the lifestyle, which we will get into later. So the process of finding volunteer or seasonal work is relatively easy, and straightforward. There are websites like Workaway, Volunteer Match, and Action Without Borders. You find a volunteer or seasonal work opportunity, and you just apply. Unlike the traditional job market, these are relatively easy to get as they don't pay you much, but in return, they offer you free food and accommodation. If you apply to enough of these, you will for sure get accepted to one at some point. The most common method of volunteering for young people traveling is simply volunteering at youth hostels. It's very convenient for both sides, as you simply get a room in the hostel for free in return for doing some cleaning, checking in guests, and paperwork. Other examples of volunteering include being an au pair, helping out on a farm, or being a leader at a youth summer camp. Seasonal work also usually covers your accommodation expenses, but unlike volunteering, they actually pay you a few $100s or euros per week. The trade-off is instead of working a chill 20 hours per week, it's a more serious and unpleasant 40 hours a week. It definitely has more of a serious 9-to-5 vibe, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the video, which is checking out of society. But since it's seasonal and temporary, it allows you to save up and check out later. So overall, both have a relatively low barrier to entry and are a good option for young people. Whether you choose one or the other just depends on what you value. Do you value having some savings more? Or do you value having a chill vibe where it doesn't even feel like you're working more? We'll put volunteering, seasonal work in the A tier. I think it's a great option for young men to get out of the toxicity of Western culture while learning valuable social and community connections. The security of having your accommodation covered also makes it a much safer and less stressful option than just outright traveling and hoping it works out. Number 6, van life. Okay, so we're now getting into the more difficult and extreme lifestyles here. In the past few years, van life has absolutely surged in popularity on YouTube, with van life influencers such as Ryan Toomey and former Marvel filmmaker Trent Arendt amassing hundreds of thousands of subscribers documenting their lives, living out of a van renovated specifically for the purposes of being a full-time living space. These guys do everything from cooking to sleeping to even playing video games out of their van. They drive along the American highways and find campsites or even just stealth camp. The van life is actually surprisingly more comfortable and cozy than you'd think. They have some pretty nice bed setups. I even low-key envy the quality of sleep they seem to get. They cook delicious meals and get to travel and see the most beautiful, relaxing nature sites that the world has to offer. And yes, as you can see, you can even play video games out of your van with the right setup. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of downsides to this lifestyle as well. For one, the barrier of entry is quite a bit heftier than any of the other options on this list. According to the van life blog Barefoot Theory, new panel-style vans that are viable for conversation can range anywhere from $40,000 to over $60,000. This is just for the van itself. You then also have to convert it to an actual viable living van, which, depending on the company, will run you anywhere from $60,000 to even $250,000. You can save a lot by converting it yourself, which will cost you in the range of $10,000 to $20,000, but not everyone knows how to do this. Anyways, the point is, you're looking at a pretty hefty price for initial barrier to entry, and on top of that, you still have to pay registration fees, gas fees, and insurance, as well as a gym membership, as that's how most van lifers use the bathroom and shower. So while it's certainly a lot cheaper than the traditional route of renting or taking out a mortgage, it's certainly not free, like some of the other options we discussed. According to the blog, van life can be as cheap as $800 a month if you live very minimalistically, or up to $2,000 if you let loose more. This, of course, isn't even including the initial cost of the van itself. So you will likely have to find some source of income as well, likely some sort of remote work, or even becoming the next big van life influencer yourself. Hey, why not you, right? The other issue with van life is it's bound to be extremely socially isolating. Now, if you're naturally a social recluse, this might not be so much of an issue. But if you're a person who needs social connection, I definitely recommend some of the other options in this video over van life. It can also be rather uncomfortable, as you'll need to depend on gyms and other public facilities to use the bathroom, and you'll be doing a lot of driving. If you don't mind all these things, and you have a reasonable amount of money saved up, however, definitely give van life a consideration. I'm going to put van life in between C and D tier here. Between the social isolation and the relatively high initial cost and barrier to entry, I personally just don't think it's for most people. But if you enjoy being on the road, being alone, and cooking your own meals, it might just work out for you. Number 7, extreme downsizing. There are some sheds, shacks, and tiny houses out in the boonies that you can get for relatively cheap. This guy, for example, paid just $8,000 for his own shed. With a couple of additions such as solar panels and a water tank, he's able to produce his own running water and electricity, and he literally has no bills to pay. All you really have to pay for is food and minor amenities such as soap, toothpaste, and the like. If you want to take it even more extreme, you can even grow your own food and reduce your bills even closer to zero. Best of all, you actually own something of your own, which is something most people these days can't say. Now, as with every other lifestyle on this list, this comes with its own downsides. These properties are generally way out in the boonies, so the social isolation is really crippling. Unlike van life, you're going to be stuck in the same place every day, which can get really depressing and monotonous. Video games and VR might be able to mitigate that to a certain extent. If you're feeling mentally strong enough to handle the isolation, then definitely consider this option. We'll put this between the B and C tier. It's cheaper than van life and gives you permanent ownership of something unlike all the other options on this list. I personally just feel, though, like the isolation and depression of doing the same thing every day keeps it from getting into A or S tier. Number 8, living in an intentional community. These were formerly known as communes. However, in an effort to separate themselves from hippies, today they prefer to be referred to as intentional communities. These are small communities of usually a few hundred people or so, with a common goal or mindset, usually some kind of spiritual or environmentalism, and of course wanting to get away from the grind of society. They live in co-housing, environmentally friendly living arrangements and are situated out in the peaceful nature. The application process to get in one of these is a pretty straightforward process. You find one online that you think would suit you best, you apply, and then you go through a temporary probation period. And whether you get accepted to live there on a more long-term basis or not is purely up to the discretion of the community. You generally work 40 hours a week to help clean, grow food, and maintain facilities around the community. And in exchange, you get food, accommodation, and in some cases, a small stipend salary. A lot of you are probably thinking this isn't really checking out of society, it's just replacing one society with another, which you're technically correct about this. Working 40 hours a week definitely sounds like a different kind of 9-to-5 grind, but there's no overlord or boss constantly looking over your shoulder. Generally, things are mostly done on a good faith basis in intentional communities. The downside of this option is you are completely dependent on the members of the community, which in a way defeats the purpose of reducing dependency on society. You basically have all your eggs in the basket of hoping you get along and vibe with the community there. Of course, they're more likely to be like-minded to you if they themselves chose to live there. We'll put intentional communities in the B tier. I think it's a great option for young men trying to check out of society. You just have to hope you find a good community if you try this option, but if you're considering it, I think it's definitely at least worth it to try, as you can always come home if you don't like it. Number 9, homesteading. This is a pretty extreme option that comes pretty damn close to a full-on opt-out of society entirely. The only more extreme lifestyle is our very last one, which you will see after this. This is essentially farming. You save up a pretty hefty lump sum to buy land and build the necessary facilities for living, growing food, and raising animals. You live off the grid and are almost completely independent of society. The main benefit of homesteading, aside from a near-complete cutoff from society, is it's probably the most organically healthy lifestyle you can live. Growing all your own food means you have all the freshest, healthiest, and most organic produce for your diet. On top of that, it inherently requires a lot of physical movement to maintain a homestead, so physical exercise generally isn't a problem. It is, however, a lot of work, and according to various sources on the internet, can cost around $200,000 to start up. I'm going to put this option in the F tier. If this were a tier list for middle-aged or older men, I might have it up higher. But I just don't see this as a viable option for most young men. It generally costs six figures to start up, which is not an amount most young men have saved up. And even if you somehow had that much money, in my opinion, it would be way better spent on other things. Most young guys probably also don't have the skills to fully self-sustain a homestead, and the social isolation isn't great while you're young either. I wouldn't really recommend this unless you really know what you're doing. But this is just a tier list where I present you the options. At the end of the day, the choice is all yours. Number 10, extreme survivalism. Okay, so as promised, we're going to end things with a bang. This method is by far the most extreme, insane, and intense option of them all. This is also the only one that's truly 100% fully checking out of society, as the other options are more just reducing dependency on society. This method is extreme survivalism. This involves straight up venturing out into the wilderness with nothing more than an axe, shovel, and a few other tools, and living off the land in the most literal sense imaginable. You basically learn primitive survival skills that our very early cavemen ancestors used to survive and, well, hope for the best, I guess. You might be thinking that this isn't even possible to pull off, and in most cases, you would be right. However, there are a select few individuals who have made it work and actually thrived with extreme survivalism. This Southeast Asian girl, for example, has over 1 million subscribers on YouTube from building these incredible, even luxurious structures, starting completely from scratch with only an axe and shovel. She's built beautiful bamboo houses, underground tunnels, and even colorful luxury swimming pools purely off the free resources of the land. There's also a young Swedish YouTuber named Eric Grankvist who documented his whole journey of surviving 3 years and counting purely off the land in an uninhabited forest in Sweden. He has built a log cabin, caught his own food, and boiled his own water. Craziest of all is he started this journey at just 18 years old after being inspired by American survivalist Richard Pernick. I mean, this guy is just an absolute giga-chad. Both the pros and cons of this lifestyle are fairly self-explanatory. It costs literally no money to start and has absolutely zero barrier to entry. It's also an incredible journey of courage and self-preservation. And if a doomsday scenario were to ever happen, you'd be the best candidate to survive. The cons are equally obvious. It's super extreme, isolating, risky, dangerous, and even potentially life-threatening. It is absolutely not for the faint of heart. I'm going to put extreme survivalism in the D tier. It is absolutely not for 99% of guys. The only thing that keeps it from being F tier is it's kind of like the final boss of a mission. It's by far the hardest to pull, but if you manage to successfully do it, you will no doubt become an absolute fearless giga-chad by the end, and you will be one of few people who have ever been able to say they fully, completely, successfully checked out of society. So, that's it for today's tier list, guys. What do you guys think? Which one of these options appealed to you the most? Is there anyone you are seriously considering after watching this video? Let me know in the comments, and best of luck in your own personal journey, whatever path you choose.